Welcome back to Japanese religion. In this video, we're going to talk about religion during the Sengoku and Edo periods. The Sengoku period was a chaotic period of civil war between rival samurai clans. So even though the emperors of Japan did continue to rule in the imperial capital, they remained figureheads, and there was fighting among the samurai for who should be the shogun or the military ruler of all Japan. So in practice, Japan was divided up into different warring kingdoms, you could say, or clans during this period. Also, during the Sengoku period, Europeans first discovered or came into contact with Japan. So this happened by accident. In 1543, some Portuguese sailors were blown off course and shipwrecked on Japan. Eventually, they were able to return, and they brought with them some Catholic clergymen. The Portuguese were interested in trading with Japan, and later on they were joined by Dutch merchants. The Catholic order of priests, known as the Jesuits or Society of Jesus, was spearheading a lot of the Catholic Church's missionary activity during this period, although there were other orders of clergy involved as well. So the leader of the Jesuits in Japan was Francis Xavier, who you can see pictured here. And they were trying to convert, ideally, all the Japanese to Catholic Christianity. They did succeed in converting some, but a majority remained Buddhist or the mix of Buddhism and Shinto. There were other Catholic clergy active in Japan at this time as well. But the Jesuits played a big role in missionary activities throughout Asia, including China, for example. And there was continuous trade that had been established between Japan and the Portuguese and Dutch. Among other things, the Japanese imported and eventually learned how to make on their own basically archaic firearms, which changed the nature of warfare there to a certain extent, although it was still dominated by the samurai clans. And they imported some other innovations. So some people did convert to Christianity, but it was a minority. So the Sengoku period came to an end with something called the Uzuki Momo period. In this period, there were a series of warlords, including Oda Nobunaga and his lieutenant Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And technically, they did not succeed in completely uniting the whole country. You can see on this map the areas in pink or peach were some daimyo, some samurai lords who were not loyal to Oda Nobunaga or his lieutenant Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, they did succeed in controlling most of Japan, so they were starting to centralize control and ending the constant fighting. Oda Nobunaga, the one who first started to dominate the rival samurai lords, initially, he supported Christianity, mainly because he saw it as a countervailing power. He didn't see them as a threat because he was more threatened by Buddhist armed groups in the country. There were some Tendai warrior monks who would sometimes fight samurai, and also the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land, had some militias, and they actually controlled some provinces. So he was thinking he could use the Christians to dampen the power of some of these Buddhist sects. He also personally profited a lot from trade with the European merchants. So he had a basic monopoly, or he greatly controlled the trade with the European merchants. And so he was basically the sole source of those imported goods in Japan. And so he didn't want to cut off that financial source for himself. So Oda's successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, basically succeeded in unifying most of Japan. As soon as he had done that, he set off on trying to invade Korea. He had these series of campaigns in Korea. The Japanese actually did have some successes on the battlefield, but they were essentially unable to retain control of any of the territory they had seized and were eventually pushed out of Korea. Toyotomi Hideyoshi also created some new laws which regulated the social classes more. There had been for a long time a big divide between commoners and elites. The elites included the imperial court, the noble clans around the emperor, and also the samurai clans. However, during the Sengoku period, because of the constant fighting, some of this class system had broken down a bit. There were commoners who had taken up arms, had become warriors, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes to get an advantage, and some of them became quite successful. There were also samurai who, for various reasons, had returned to farming and laid down arms, essentially. This just has to do with all the social dislocations from the fighting, essentially. And so Toyotomi Hideyoshi thought this could be a destabilizing influence, so he wanted to make the class lines more rigid. So he made it illegal for commoners, people not of samurai birth, to bear arms like swords and other weapons. And the samurai were basically required to live in castle towns, so they would not be able to make a living just by farming. They had to serve in the forces of daimyo or lords. Toyotomi Hideyoshi also turned against the Christians. So this is known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan in Catholic Christianity. But there were 26 Japanese, European, and one Mexican Christian who were in Japan. There were more at the time, but those are the ones who Toyotomi decided to torture, mutilate, publicly parade, and then publicly crucify to basically try to discourage anyone from becoming Christian. Christianity had started to look like a threat to Japanese culture and politics, and so Toyotomi Hideyoshi turned against the Christians. There still were some Christian groups, though, that survived this persecution. Toyotomi Hideyoshi also really was a big patron of the arts and of religion because he became very wealthy as a result of controlling Japan. So one example of this is the Golden Tea Room. This is a tea room for the tea ceremony, Cha no Yu, that was covered in gold leaf. So it's considered, one of the great pieces of Japanese architecture or tea ceremony design, but it was very lavish. And he also built many Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi's successor was Tokugawa Ieyasu. And Tokugawa was really the one who created a long-lasting, centralized government. So he completely dominated the other samurai lords, the daimyo. He was the sole power source, essentially. And he set about creating new laws that he thought would make a more stable political order to prevent a return to the chaotic and really destructive civil war that was seen in the Sengoku period. So he increased the amount of regulations on the classes, made the class system even more rigid, he and his successors, and created a bunch of other regulations, basically closing Japan off to the rest of the world. He and his successors tried to get rid of any European influence, including Christianity, but also trade with Europe was strictly controlled. The Portuguese were not allowed in the country. So this period is known as the Edo period or the Tokugawa Shogunate or Tokugawa Bakufu, military government. And it lasted, you can see, almost 300 years, from 1600 to 1867. So let's talk a bit more about the suppression of Christianity under the Tokugawa Shogunate during the Edo period. So Tokugawa, like his predecessor, regarded Christians as meddling in politics and as undermining the social order. And this attitude was basically continued by his successors. So in the 1620s, there were persecutions of Christians. And in 1637, there was a large rebellion against the Tokugawa Shogunate. And this was called the Shimabara Rebellion. And not all of the Shimabara rebels were Christians, but many of them were. And they were basically all put to death. So it was a massacre, and most of the Christians were wiped out around that time. In the wake of this, in the 1640s, the Portuguese were expelled. The Dutch were allowed to trade. They were seen as less meddlesome in politics and not trying to convert everyone to their form of Christianity. So they were seen as safer trade partners, but they were restricted to only trade at one port, Dejima. And despite the persecution of Christianity, there were, interestingly, some hidden Christians who survived in remote areas by disguising themselves as Buddhists. So on the right is a picture of an icon that is actually of the Virgin Mary, but the style of it looks like the Buddhist Bodhisattva Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion. But you can see she's holding an infant, which is not a characteristic of Kannon, but it is a characteristic of the Virgin Mary. But eventually, my understanding is these hidden Christians, they didn't retain, there weren't that many of them, and also eventually they just kind of blended into the population so that they didn't have a really distinct identity as Christians per se. Maybe they and others regarded them just as kind of funky Buddhists, so to speak, after enough generations had passed. So let's talk about Buddhism during the Edo period. Initially, among the early shogun of the Tokugawa Shogunate, they supported Soto Zen. Soto Zen had become popular among a lot of the samurai during the Sengoku period and before. And they also took some interest in regulating Buddhism. So this is that principle, that pattern of the Japanese government regulating religion that did go back to ancient times, but this was a bit more fine-grained. So they actually required all Soto Zen temples to follow Dogen's teachings specifically in how they conducted themselves, based on Eiheiji, the main monastery for Soto Zen that he had founded, the way that was run. They also created a nationwide system called the Danka system that required all Japanese people to register at a Buddhist temple. Now, partly this was to make sure that there weren't these pockets of secret Christians or others, but also so they could create a kind of census of the population and have some way of keeping tabs on everyone, so to speak. So it was a kind of using temples as part of the administrative apparatus of the state. And that did happen earlier in Japanese history as well, with the Five Mountains system of monasteries that were used as kind of like regional government centers, but this was much more systematic. And this tradition or custom of all Japanese families registering at a local temple, it's no longer universal, but it continued up until modern times, essentially. This was basically still happening in the 18 and early 1900s. Another significant event during the Edo period was a Japanese edition of the Chinese Tripitaka, or Buddhist canon, was printed using woodblock printing. This was a technique that had been first developed in China that allows you to print not with movable type, but on wood blocks that are carved with the characters. And so you can, it takes a lot of time to create each block, but you can reuse it. And there were some printed editions of the Buddhist canon also in Korea and China. But this was the first edition completed in Japan, the first complete edition. And it was actually using Chinese characters. So something worth emphasizing is that this is to some extent still the case. Chinese is regarded as the language of Buddhism in Japan because their earliest texts were in Chinese. And so there was a kind of a tradition of Chinese scholarship of Buddhism in Japan carried on by Japanese scholars. And that continues to some extent to this day in the universities there. So another interesting person during the Edo period was Menzan Suiho. He wrote authoritative commentaries on Dogen that essentially became adopted by Soto Zen temples as the correct or proper way of interpreting Dogen's writings. And my understanding is that still kind of sets the pattern for how Soto Zen Buddhists understand Dogen to this day. So later on during the Edo period, Neo-Confucianism became very influential. So this Neo-Confucian label is referring to Song Ming Rujia, the Rujia or Confucianism during the Song and Ming dynasties of China. So the Confucian scholars Chu Shi and Wang Yangming were the founders or some of the main exponents of this school. And even though Buddhism remained quite popular, the majority of Japanese during the Edo period were active Buddhists. There were some Confucian scholars who criticized Buddhism as being foreign and as being against the Confucian values of marrying, of having families, honoring your ancestors, etc. So they thought the monastic lifestyle was socially problematic. And they also criticized, ironically, monks for not following their own rules. So there were monks who were marrying, there were monks who were eating meat, and this is again, so there's a kind of hypocrisy there they were pointing out. So later on in the Edo period, Neo-Confucianism was supported by the government as something they believed could create social, political order. And the Confucian class system, which had developed earlier in China, was used in Japan. And they actually created a whole system of laws and regulations based on the social class of the family you were born into. So the traditional Confucian view is there's four main social classes: nobles or scholars, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. And merchants were placed at the bottom because they were regarded as somehow kind of greedy and impure for that reason. So this was interpreted with nobles being the samurai clans. So they were the natural ruling class. It also kind of associated being a samurai with being a junse, a Confucian gentleman. This was made explicit by the Neo-Confucian scholar Yamaga Soko. And so this basically became the pattern or part of the blueprint for the Edo period regulations on the classes. So what job you could take, where you could travel, what weapons, if any, you could carry, etc., were all governed by laws during this period. How you could address people, and it was an unequal system. It was hierarchical. So samurai had rights over other classes. If you didn't bow to a samurai, if you were from a lower class, you could get into trouble, etc. So as the Edo period wore on, there were some new systems of thought that emerged that were emphasizing Japanese culture and tradition, but in a way that conflicted with the status quo. So one of these was kokugaku, which can be translated as native learning or national learning. And this was founded by Oda Nobunaga. So he argued that Japanese religion and culture should be prioritized in Japan. So traditionally, Japan had always looked up to China, Chinese language, culture, literature, religion, art, and not completely, but to a great extent, sort of pattern itself on the Chinese model. You can see that in the history of Japanese Buddhists who traveled to China to learn more about Buddhism. You can see that in the fact that their Buddhist scriptures were still in Chinese, etc. You can even see that in the Neo-Confucians who were just, trying to adopt ideas that had been developed in China to Japan. But Oda Nobunaga argued that no, Japan should base its political and social order on its own native traditions and not on foreign traditions. So this was kind of radical and new, in fact. So because he was looking at Confucianism and Buddhism as foreign traditions, he advocated the use of the oldest Japanese texts, Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, as sources of wisdom that potentially all people should study. And so the idea is we're not going to have the Buddhist scriptures or the Confucian classics as the basis of our culture. We're going to have these mythical and historical texts. And you can actually see potentially parallels with European intellectual movements going on at the same time. Towards the end of the 1700s is when you get the rise of what are called Romanticism and nationalism. Romanticism was a great many things, but it was a kind of reaction against the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was an idea, especially in the 1700s, a movement in Europe and other Western countries that advocated holding reason, science, experience, freedom above religion, traditional authorities, customs that were making people unequal in society. The Enlightenment were supporters of governments that gave people basic rights. Even if they had monarchs, they were regulated by law. They supported not necessarily going against all religion, but trying to have a rational approach to religion, not giving the church so much authority over people's minds, etc. The Romantics, they had some things in common with the Enlightenment, but they regarded the Enlightenment's emphasis on science and reason and moderation or control as being unreasonable and kind of against human nature in a way. So the Romantics thought that emotion, in a sense, should take priority over reason, or at least be on an equal footing. And they took inspiration not just from human science and culture, but also from nature. And the Romantics, another thing they believed was that each nation or culture has its own kind of essence. And so there isn't a universal scientific or political order that should be all around the world, as many people in the Enlightenment had envisioned. There's one right way of regulating society, and we should just do that everywhere. And we should focus on the commonalities of people. The Romantics thought that each culture or nation has its own essence and could have its own social systems, its own culture, etc. And so Romanticism kind of influenced nationalism too, which was the idea that you should be loyal not to a king or a religion or a clan, but to people united by the same language and culture. And you shouldn't be loyal to your own social class even, but to the nation as a whole. So nationalism today is often thought of as a kind of regressive thing, but back then it was a way of kind of like uniting society, regarding all the people as your fellow countrymen, regardless of whether they were noble or even kings. You were all part of the same nation. It really kind of started in France during the French Revolution in the late 1700s. Well, Motoori Norinaga's ideas were not so far away from these. He was basically saying that Japan has its own essence, and it's found in these ancient mythic, mystic texts. So that was something that would have been looked upon very negatively by the Enlightenment, but the Romantics and the nationalists of Europe had very similar ideas about their own cultural traditions. Another influential movement during the later Edo period was Kokutai. This can be translated as national polity or national essence, and this was founded by Aizawa Seishisai. So this was similar to Kokugaku, except he was advocating the unification of religion and politics through what would be known as state Shinto. So using Shinto as a common religious tradition to unite all Japanese. But it goes along with that idea that the Japanese should rely upon their own cultural traditions, put those, give those priority, put those in first place, and not structure their society and culture through the ideas of foreigners. And he was thinking both of the Chinese tradition, but also of Westerners as a potentially corrupting or controlling influence. So his idea was to have a new form of Shinto in a sense, with Amaterasu, the sun kami, as the primary kami worshipped by all Japanese. So it would not be a monotheistic religion per se, but there would be this unifying element that the main kami everyone would worship was Amaterasu, because she is the kami of Japan in a way. She's the ancestor of the emperors, so she's the protector of the nation. And he also regarded restoring the emperors to actually ruling the country and making the emperor a kind of unifying theme. So everyone follows the emperor, everyone venerates the emperor, and everyone worships Amaterasu. And partly this was based on his analysis of Westerners. So the Japanese, even though they were quite isolated from the rest of the world during this time in terms of trade and contacts, they did know what was going on. They knew quite well what was going on. and they saw the power of the Western nations, which especially in the early 1800s were projecting power even more throughout the world as a result of the industrialization of the late 17 and early 1800s. Aizawa Seishisai thought that the Westerners had gained power through using Christianity to unite and control their people. So not only through industrialization, but through this ideological or religious angle. And he also believed that Westerners used Christianity. So they had missionaries coming to foreign countries, and he thought it was to subvert those nations and make them easier to control. So he was against allowing any Western influence, but he wanted to follow what he regarded as the Western model of unifying the country through a national religion. This did not happen during the Edo period, but it was to influence the following period of Japanese history, the Meiji period.